The wind howled as the stagecoach creaked to a stop at the edge of a dusty Montana homestead. Clouds threatened rain, though the sky was the color of bleached denim, stretched wide and unforgiving over the prairie. Clara tightened her grip on her worn leather suitcase, the only possession she had left from her old life. The wheels of the coach groaned behind her as it pulled away, leaving a plume of dust and silence in its wake. She stood alone now, lace gloves dulled by the long journey, her green traveling dress wrinkled and faded from weeks on the road. Her eyes scanned the horizon, searching for the man she had exchanged letters with for over a year. His words had been kind, if a little reserved, an honest farmer looking for companionship, for help raising his children, for someone steady and strong to build a future with. She had imagined him standing by a fence post, hat in hand, maybe with a hopeful smile. But there was no man in sight. Instead, 7 children stood in the doorway of the sagging farmhouse. They were like ghosts, pale, still, uncertain. The eldest, a tall boy of about 12, held a crying baby awkwardly on his hip. His face was pinched, not by cruelty, but by responsibility far too heavy for someone so young. A girl stood beside him, thin braids dangling past her shoulders, her hands gripping the edges of her apron as if holding herself together. The others stood in a ragged line behind them, some barefoot, all watching Clara like she was a puzzle they weren't sure how to solve. Clara's steps slowed as she approached the porch, her heart suddenly thudding in her chest. "Good afternoon," she said softly, voice trembling with confusion more than fear. "I'm looking for Mr. Whitmore. Mr. James Whitmore. He sent for me." The boy shifted the baby in his arms and looked at her, unblinking. "You're Miss Clara?" She nodded. "Yes, I am." There was a pause, thick and heavy with things unspoken. "I'm Eli," he said. "Pa died last week. Fever took him." Clara's breath caught in her throat. The wind lifted the hem of her dress, but she didn't move. Behind Eli, the littlest child began to wail, loud, aching sobs that made Clara's heart twist. Eli rocked her gently, but his hands were unsure. He was trying so hard to be a man. I didn't know," Clara said. Her voice felt far away, like it belonged to someone else. She reached into her coat and pulled out a letter, the last one he'd sent, dated 6 weeks ago. He said he was recovering. He said you all were doing well. Eli shrugged. He was. Then he wasn't. It happened fast. Clara looked up at the house. The shutters hung crooked, and a loose board clapped against the siding with each gust of wind. There was no smoke from the chimney. No smell of food. No warmth. "We thought maybe someone would come anyway," Eli added after a long silence. "He talked about you. Said you were coming soon. We didn't know what to do." One of the middle children, a girl with tangled hair and dirt-smudged cheeks, stepped forward. "Are you gonna leave?" Clara blinked, startled. The question hit her like a slap. She hadn't even had time to consider it yet. The girl squinted up at her, defiant in her worry. "The preacher's wife said maybe you'd come, see us, and just go back where you came from." Another child, a boy barely taller than the girl, added, "Ain't nobody else come. Just you." Clara's hand fell to her side, letter fluttering in the wind. She looked at each child in turn, faces hollowed by grief, shoulders hunched not from weather, but from waiting. Waiting for someone. Anyone. She stepped closer to the porch, her boots crunching on gravel. The wind hadn't let up all evening. It shrieked through the cracks in the walls of the farmhouse like a living thing, rattling loose boards and shaking the windows in their warped frames. Inside, the house was dim, lit only by the faint orange glow of a dying fire in the hearth. The children were scattered across the floor on blankets and patched quilts, curled together like small animals seeking warmth. Clara sat at the kitchen table, alone, her hands wrapped around a chipped enamel mug of tea gone cold. She hadn't spoken much since supper. Not that there was much to say. The meal had been simple, cornbread and beans she'd found in the pantry, stretched thin and served on mismatched plates. The children had eaten quietly, without complaint, as if silence had become their native language. Now, they slept, their tiny forms rising and falling with each breath. She had expected the day to end differently. She had imagined a warm bed, a strong arm around her waist, perhaps even the comfort of soft conversation with a man she'd come to know better with time. Instead, she was in a stranger's kitchen, mourning a stranger's death, surrounded by the orphaned remnants of a life that had vanished before she arrived. Her suitcase still sat by the door. She hadn't unpacked. She wasn't sure if she would. The next stagecoach wouldn't come for another 3 days, but that didn't mean she had to stay. She could walk to town, find a room at the inn, wire a message back east. She had enough money for a return ticket, barely. She could go back to Missouri, back to her cousin's house where she was always the unwelcome guest, where she was treated more like charity than family. At least there she had known what to expect. But when the baby whimpered, Clara turned her head instinctively. The oldest girl, Nora, she thought her name was, stirred in her sleep but didn't wake. Clara rose, setting the mug down, and patted softly over the wooden floor until she reached the cradle. The child's cheeks were flushed, tiny fists balled tight near her chin. Clara leaned down and gently brushed a strand of hair from the baby's forehead. The child settled at her touch. She straightened, heart aching. What did she know about caring for 7 children? She had no training, no experience. She had never married, never had a child of her own. All she had were the skills life had taught her, how to stretch a dollar, how to mend socks, how to hide pain with a smile. Was that enough? The baby gave a soft sigh and nestled deeper into her blanket. Clara stood still, watching her, the silence settling in like a quilt pulled over weary shoulders. In the corner of the room, the fireplace crackled as if waking for a moment, casting light over the faces of the children asleep on the floor. They looked so small in this big, empty house. One of the boys had curled up with a pair of boots under his head, like a pillow. Another clutched a tin toy missing a wheel. They had no mother. No father. No one. Clara turned back to the kitchen table, dragging the chair closer to the fire. She picked up the small sewing kit she had packed for the journey and began to stitch a torn hem on one of the boys' shirts she'd found near the wash basin. Her fingers moved with quiet purpose, the kind that came from doing something that mattered, even if no one noticed. The wind had eased, but the cold had deepened. Winter clung to the homestead like a second skin, seeping through the walls, creeping under the doors, settling into the bones of the house and the people in it. The days began before the sun rose and ended long after it disappeared, filled with endless small tasks that piled on Clara like snowfall, light at first, then heavy, suffocating. Clara woke every morning before the children, lighting the stove in the dark with frozen fingers. She fumbled with kindling and matches, her breath fogging in front of her face. The stove was old and moody, its flue stubborn and its firebox rusted. On more than one occasion, smoke billowed into the kitchen, leaving her coughing, eyes watering. One morning, while trying to adjust a burning log that had slipped forward, she burned her palm on the cast iron edge. The skin blistered instantly. She gritted her teeth and said nothing. There was no one to complain to, and no time for self-pity. Food was another worry. The root cellar was nearly bare. The chickens had stopped laying in the cold. She traded what little she had, a sack of dried apples, 2 jars of preserves, and the silver locket that had once belonged to her mother, for a sack of flour and a few pounds of salt pork from the store in town. She carried it back in the same satchel that had brought her dreams westward, now heavy with obligation. The children watched her constantly. Not always with trust, and never with affection, not yet. Their eyes tracked her as she moved through the house, wary, like stray dogs waiting to see if this new hand would feed or strike. Nora helped with the baby but rarely spoke, her mouth a thin line of responsibility. Eli, the eldest boy, tried to act like the man of the house, but his shoulders sagged when he thought no one was looking. The younger ones were quieter. The littlest girl, Ruthie, flinched when Clara reached for her hair to brush it. The middle boy, Tom, hid his socks in the stove one morning, preferring the bite of frost to the shame of holes in the heels. Clara began mending every night. She sat by the fire with a basket of clothes beside her, patching, darning, stitching by lamplight until her eyes blurred. Her burned hand throbbed with every tug of the needle, but she worked through the pain. Her sewing became prayers, small, quiet hopes stitched into threadbare shirts and unraveling cuffs. Maybe if she could fix the clothes, she could fix what was broken inside this house too. One evening, after supper, she found Eli outside, splitting wood in the snow. His coat was too thin, and his cheeks were red with windburn. She brought him a blanket and tried to drape it over his shoulders. He shrugged it off. "I can do it," he muttered, eyes on the chopping block. "I know you can," Clara said gently. "But you don't have to do it alone." He didn't answer, but his grip on the axe loosened. Later that week, Clara fell ill. Just a fever, not like the one that had taken their father, but it left her dizzy and weak. She tried to hide it, to keep working, but Nora caught her leaning against the table, her face pale and slick with sweat. The girl silently took the ladle from Clara's hand and began stirring the stew herself. That night, the children laid an extra quilt over Clara as she rested. She pretended to be asleep, but her throat tightened at the quiet kindness of it. Still, it was far from easy. The walls echoed with the ghosts of absence, of the man Clara never met, of the mother the children never mentioned. There were days when Clara stood at the back door staring at the hills beyond, the road that led back east calling to her. She would imagine herself walking it, her suitcase in hand, free of the weight of unfamiliar names and tiny cries in the night. But each time she turned from the door, drawn back by a cough, a spill, a broken toy, a tiny voice calling out for help, or for her, not by name, but simply, "Ma'am," or once, only once so far, "Ma." The snow had begun to melt in slow, stubborn patches, revealing the first timid signs of spring, muddy earth, the tips of last year's grass, and the distant chatter of returning birds. The sharp bite of winter still lingered in the mornings, but by midday, the sun warmed the porch enough for Clara to sit outside with a mending basket on her lap, the door open so she could hear the children playing. Something had begun to shift. It was not a grand transformation but a series of tiny moments, like water carving away at stone until a new shape emerged. The children still carried their grief, their mistrust, but it no longer weighed down every word, every glance. They moved more easily now, with laughter starting to return in flickers, quick bursts, then vanishing, then slowly returning again. Clara had not tried to replace what they had lost. She knew better than that. But she had started to give them something new, routine, warmth, and perhaps most importantly, someone who stayed. One morning, Clara awoke to the sound of voices whispering outside her door. She listened, half asleep, and heard the shuffle of bare feet, the creak of the stairs, the muffled giggle of a child trying to be quiet and failing. When she opened the door, she found a small basket on the floor. Inside were crocus flowers, still damp with morning dew, arranged in a little bundle with string and bits of ribbon. A folded piece of paper sat on top with a drawing, stick figures, 7 children and 1 woman with curly hair and a skirt that brushed the ground. They had drawn her holding hands with the baby. Her throat tightened as she crouched and touched the picture with trembling fingers. She recognized Ruthie's careful scrawl on the corner, "For Ma." They had never said it before, not clearly, not altogether. But the word stared up at her now, deliberate and certain. Later that day, when Clara brought the basket to the table to admire it properly, the children gathered around. No one said anything at first, but their eyes were on her, wide and shining with a hope that made her chest ache. She thanked them, her voice cracking, and set the flowers in a jar of water beside the window. It wasn't just the flowers. In small ways, they had started to meet her halfway. Tom, the quiet middle boy, had started showing her his wooden carvings, little animals he whittled from scraps of pine. Nora brought her lists of what needed mending and suggestions for dinner, as if recognizing Clara's role was permanent now, not temporary. Eli, though still guarded, began asking her opinion before making decisions, such as when to plant the vegetable seeds or how to fix a broken fence post. The baby no longer cried at Clara's touch but curled into her arms and sighed in contentment, fingers curled around the fabric of her apron. One evening, after a long day of scrubbing the floors and tending to the animals, Clara sat down on the porch, brushing her skirt flat and wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. The sunset spread across the sky in pinks and golds. Ruthie climbed onto her lap without a word, laid her head on Clara's chest, and fell asleep there. No flinch, no hesitation, just trust, pure and simple. From inside the house came the sound of a harmonica, Eli playing, halting and unsure, but trying. Clara looked out over the land, the fields waking from their long slumber, the trees beginning to bud, the fence lines she had helped repair, and the house behind her where laughter was becoming familiar again. The breeze that swept across the fields carried the scent of fresh-cut hay and lilacs, and the homestead was alive with sound, laughter, footsteps, the clatter of dishes being set out on long wooden tables beneath a wide, sunlit sky. The house had aged over the years, its white paint faded to a soft gray and the roof patched in places, but it stood strong, full of stories, full of life. The porch now sagged gently under the weight of children, grandchildren, and neighbors gathered for the annual spring gathering, a tradition born years ago, when life had begun anew under Clara's care. She sat in her rocking chair at the edge of the porch, wrapped in a shawl crocheted by Nora long ago, a soft smile on her weathered face. Her hands, still capable though slower now, rested on her lap as she watched the generations unfold before her. The children she had once met as strangers now stood as men and women, heads bowed in conversation, arms around their own children, who darted between legs and tables, chasing after one another with shrieks of joy. The farm had thrived. Eli, now broad-shouldered and kind-eyed, had stayed to tend the land. His hands bore the same calluses his father once had, though his heart held a gentleness born of all he had lost and all he had been given. Nora had married a schoolteacher and taught her own daughters the same sharp, steady strength Clara had once seen flicker behind a child's guarded eyes. Tom carved wooden toys for the little ones and sold his pieces at the town market, his talent no longer hidden in shadow but proudly displayed in every corner of the home. Clara's eyes followed a small girl as she toddled up the steps, curls bouncing with each movement. The child looked up at her with familiar curiosity, the same kind she had once seen in Ruthie's eyes all those years ago. The little girl climbed into Clara's lap without hesitation, settling there as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Are you really not our real grandma?" the girl asked, her voice high and honest in the way only a child's could be. Clara smiled, brushing a loose curl from the girl's forehead. "What makes someone real to you?" she asked gently. The girl thought for a moment, her brow furrowing. "Someone who stays," she said finally. "Someone who loves you, even when you cry or make a mess." Clara chuckled softly, the sound thick with emotion. She looked out over the land again, the rows of green just starting to rise from the earth, the barn repainted in red by Eli's boys, the laundry snapping on the line in the breeze. It was a place once filled with silence and sorrow, now bursting with noise, color, and life. Behind her, someone called out for more lemonade, and one of the grandchildren, maybe Ruthie's boy, rushed to the kitchen with empty pitchers. The porch filled again with movement, voices, and the easy rhythm of belonging. A photograph hung just inside the door now, a black and white image of the family in its earliest days, Clara seated in the center with the children around her, all of them younger, uncertain, and still in the thick of healing. A newer photo sat beside it, taken only last fall, filled with faces, so many faces, grown from that first fragile beginning.